And for more on this, joining me now from London is Tom Packer. He's a fellow at the University of Oxford. Tom, good to see you. Good to have you here with us on TRT World. How do you assess Henry Kissinger's impact on shaping US foreign policy, particularly in terms of his role in the opening to China, negotiating the Vietnam War exit, and reshaping power dynamics with the Soviet Union during the Cold War?
Obviously his role was massive and historic. I was actually more or less coincidentally discussing this at a conference a few months ago. I tend to the view that some historians tend to exaggerate his role a bit, that Richard Nixon had very clear foreign policy views of his own, which Kissinger largely carried out. He was particularly important actually under Gerald Ford, but Gerald Ford was only president for slightly more than 2 years and not a very powerful president. But he played an absolutely huge role, I think, particularly in how close America and China ended up, and the degree that they were trying to align with China, to get China to align against them with the Soviet Union, but quite how friendly their relationship ended up to be. And it was helpful. He and Nixon were Republicans. They weren't strongly liberal. I think he also played a very important role with Nixon in pushing a particular perspective on foreign policy, what's often called realism. So not ideological anti-communism like the right, not ideological support for progressive politics abroad like the left. So he actually had lots of conservative critics. The 1976 Republican platform came very close to denouncing him by name, or his foreign policy. It all but did so. So he was a very controversial figure, but interestingly, he was always when he was a very prominent political figure in the 70s, he always polled very well. He was very popular with the general public, and I think this kind of what you might call realist, American first, defending American national interest perspective is actually one that, in many ways, is more popular with the general public than it is with elites, at least in the United States.
Tom, from a geopolitical perspective, what were the key successes and failures of Henry Kissinger's foreign policy?
Well, you could suggest how much you should give him credit for this, but I think China was going to align with America anyway. But just how close that got, that had caused huge problems for the Soviet Union and arguably precipitated their late 80s reforms and fall. I also think he's underrated. He himself said he was much prouder of what he'd achieved in the Middle East than Vietnam. And I think that was actually a very sort of striking moment. It's under Kissinger and Nixon that America and Israel get very closely aligned. It's very interesting the way they use that to make it clear to Egypt the only way they're going to get the Sinai Peninsula back is by being closer to America, which Egypt then does. So it really weakens the Soviet Union's power in the Middle East. I think he had a lot of failures in Congress. They were struggling to get support. I think Vietnam, ultimately, he himself, I think, would have said it was a failure. But arguably a failure domestically as much as anything else. Like ultimately, American support for South Vietnam collapsed. So North Vietnam was able to conquer South Vietnam without American intervention. So in many ways, that was a domestic political problem. I would say that he would be seen as his greatest failure. They also had great trouble stopping Soviet expansion in parts of the Third World, which we forget about now. The Soviet Union's fallen. Again, a lot of that owed to the fact that the Cold War consensus was falling to pieces. And China, of course, would be very an interesting story, because some might say America's policies on China, particularly after the end of the Cold War, have been foolish and have created a very powerful rival for them. Others might say America has become too confrontational with China recently, and others might have a complicated combination of both. So it's like someone said to Kissinger once, it's too early about the French Revolution. It's too early to tell.
Tom, allow me to pick your brain here. Considering the controversial aspects of Kissinger's legacy, how should analysts balance his contributions to diplomacy with criticism of his realpolitik approach and allegations of involvement in actions deemed detrimental to human rights?
I think the truth is we all have different sets of values, but I think what one wants to do is be fair-minded about it. And I think, I think it's good to speak ill of the dead unless they're truly colossal villains, which I don't think Henry Kissinger was. And I think one thing that gets exaggerated a lot is the American involvement in a lot of these. So whatever one thinks of the murders of millions of people by Pakistani militias or the Chilean coup by Pinochet, I think it's really easy to exaggerate how important America was. Like the Chilean military actually hated the Allende government and wanted to get rid of them. The notion that they were doing everything because they were getting it from America. In fact, America backed a failed coup earlier, the famous Pinochet coup. So I think one thing one should be very careful about is treating even Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon as if they were kings of the world. Actually, huge parts of the world have their own agenda. What's going on? The US matters, the USSR mattered. But that doesn't mean people are primarily carrying out deeds, including very bad deeds, because of the US's pressure. And I think it's also worth seeing the situation at the time where, to the US, it looked very grim. There was huge tide against the Cold War, against intervening abroad. There was great worries about the power of the Soviet Union. There was a increasing view that the Soviet Union was becoming more powerful, but there was also the possibility of détente. And in many ways, Kissinger and Nixon tried to balance in a very difficult and awkward world.
Tom Packer, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World.
Thank you.